answering the question at all? And why does your classmate help you out when it could get them in trouble? If you want the right answers to these questions, we need to talk about social interaction. And we need to talk about reality. Because according to some sociological theories, the reality of your social world in your classroom and beyond is basically a huge lifelong stage play. Social interaction is simply the process by which people act and react in relation to others. Whenever people converse or yell or fight or play sports, that's social interaction. And any place you find social interaction, you're going to find social structure. Social structure consists of the relationships among people and groups. And this structure gives direction to and sets limits on our behavior, because our relationships establish certain expectations of everyone involved, depending on the social setting. This is really obvious in a classroom. The teacher teaches and the students learn, because that's the expectation for that relationship in that setting. But if you run into a teacher, say at the mall, you both behave differently, and probably awkwardly, because the expectations for your interaction in that social setting have changed. Now, this still doesn't tell us why these relationships work the way they do, but it does tell us where to look. If our interactions are a matter of expectations, then we need to understand how those expectations are set, and for that, we need to talk about social status. Status is a position that a person occupies in a society or social group. It's part of their identity, and it defines their relationships with other people. So the status of teacher defines how a teacher should relate to their students. But statuses aren't just professions. Gender, race, and sexual orientation are all social statuses, as are being a father or a child or a citizen. And all the statuses held by a single person make up that person's status set. That status set can tell us a lot about a person, because statuses exist in a hierarchy, with some statuses being more valued than others. So if I tell you that someone is a white, middle-aged male CEO, then you can make some pretty reasonable guesses about his education, wealth, and the power he holds in society. And you've probably noticed that there are different kinds of statuses. For example, white, middle-aged, and male are pretty different from the status of CEO. The first three are all ascribed statuses. Ascribed statuses are those in which a person has no choice. They're either assigned at birth or assigned involuntarily later in life. Race, for instance, is an ascribed status assigned at birth, while the ascribed status of middle-aged happens at a point later in life. CEO, on the other hand, is an achieved status. It's earned, accomplished, or obtained with at least some effort on the person's part. Professions, then, are achieved statuses, so is being a student or a parent. Beyond this difference, there's also the fact that some statuses are more important than others. A master status is the status others are most likely to use to identify you. This can be achieved like professor or ascribed like cancer patient. And as that example shows you, a master status doesn't need to be positive or desirable. In fact, it doesn't even need to be important to the person who holds it. It just needs to be important to other people who use the status as their primary way of locating that person in the social hierarchy. Also, statuses tend to clump together in certain ways. Most CEOs are college educated, for example, but they aren't always. And a mismatch or contradiction between statuses is called a status inconsistency. When we talk about PhD students working as baristas, we're really bringing it up in that way because there's a status inconsistency between PhD and barista. At least in the industrialized world, service workers aren't supposed to be highly educated. Now, that's all very interesting, you might say, but we still haven't said that much about social interaction. And you're right. Status gets us started, but if we want to get into how people behave, then we need to talk about roles. If a status is a social position, then roles are the sets of behaviors, obligations, and privileges that go with that status. So a person holds a status, but they perform a role. Keep that word in mind. Perform. Now, since a person can have multiple statuses, they can have multiple roles too, but a single status often has multiple roles that go with it. For example, a teacher's role in the classroom is to teach and lead students. But in the faculty lounge, the status of teacher has another role, acting as a colleague to other teachers or as an employee to the principal, roles that require a whole different bunch of behaviors than those found in the classroom. But all of the roles attached to the single status of teacher make up that status's role set. All statuses have role sets, and various role sets can sometimes demand contradictory behaviors of the person who holds that set. When the roles attached to different statuses create clashing demands, that's known as role conflict. Parents who work, for instance, often need to decide between the demands of their jobs and the demands of their families, which can lead to role conflict. And even the roles within a single status can create contradiction in what we call role strain. A student who has responsibilities for class, but also for basketball, an orchestra, and the yearbook committee, experiences role strain as they try to balance the competing obligation of these roles, all within the context of their status as a student. Now, sometimes, whether it's because of conflict, strain, or other reasons, people just disengage from a certain role in a process called role exit. This can be voluntary, like quitting your job, or involuntary, like getting dumped. In either case, it's rarely as simple as just walking out the door, because roles are a part of who we are. So exiting a role can be traumatic, especially without preparation or if the exit isn't by choice. Now, we've been talking about roles as though they're prescriptive or that they totally determine our behavior, but they don't. Roles are guidelines, expectations that we have for ourselves and that others place on us. We may or may not internalize those expectations, but even if we do, our behavior still isn't completely controlled. But why do statuses come bundled with roles in the first place? Why can't I just not perform my role? The answer is complicated, but part of it is that, well, reality itself is socially constructed. I mean, there's nothing in the laws of physics that says some people are teachers and that those people get to ask questions and students have to answer them. But that doesn't mean these statuses aren't real and don't have real roles attached to them. One good way of thinking about this is known as the Thomas theorem, developed by early 20th century American sociologists William Thomas and Dorothy Thomas. It states, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. In other words, statuses and roles matter because we say they do. The perception creates the reality. So the reason you can't just not perform your role is that even if you don't think it matters, everyone else does think it matters. So the student who refuses to answer a question gets in trouble, while the teacher who refuses to teach and just hangs out drinking wine with their feet up on their desk gets fired. If you have the status of a teacher, people expect, even demand, that you do the things that teachers are expected to do. How you feel about your status doesn't really enter into it. And we know who's a teacher and who's a student based on our background assumptions, our experiences, and the socialization that teaches us about norms in various situations. So this is how your reality becomes socially constructed. You and everyone around you uses assumptions and experiences to define what's real. By interacting with the people around you and expecting certain behaviors in the context of roles, you actually create the social reality that shapes those interactions that you're having. The fact that this happens in interaction is really important because your social reality is not just about you. It's about everyone you're interacting with and their expectations too. It's about maintaining a performance. And this idea of performance is really central to a sociological understanding of how people interact. It's the key to what's known as the dramaturgical analysis of social interaction. This approach, pioneered by Canadian-American sociologist Erving Goffman, understands social interaction as if it were a play performed on stage for an audience. By Goffman's thinking, people literally perform roles for each other, and the point of social interaction is always, at least partly, to maintain a successful interaction that's in line with expectations, that is, to satisfy the audience. In order to do this, people need to carefully control the information others receive about them in a process called impression management. Like, if you're out on a first date, you're not going to talk about how your last relationship ended because you don't want to create a bad impression. But impression management isn't merely a matter of what you say and don't say. It's also a matter of what you wear and what you do. That is to say, it's a matter of what Goffman referred to as props and nonverbal communication. Props, as you know, are just objects that performers use to help them make a certain impression. So if you want to look professional, you wear a suit. If you want to look studious, make sure you're reading a book. And the setting can be a prop too. Being the one standing at the front of the classroom is like 50% of what it takes to look like a teacher. And nonverbal communication includes body language, like standing up straight in order to look respectable and maintaining or averting eye contact, as well as gestures like waving hello to your friend. Together, props and nonverbal communication are both examples of what Goffman called sign vehicles, things we use to help convey impressions to people we interact with. Those vehicles are important aspects of the performance, but really the most fundamental distinction is the one between what's part of the performance and what isn't. In other words, what the audience sees and what they don't. Goffman called this front stage and backstage. Front stage is where the audience is and where the performance happens, while backstage is where the performer can drop the performance and prepare. Often, the things we do backstage would totally ruin the performance we're trying to maintain front stage. A teacher cursing floridly while grading papers would be considered backstage. Important preparation for teaching is happening, but if any of her students, that is the audience, saw her, it would totally ruin the performance because it defies expectations of how teachers are supposed to act. And not all performances are one-person shows. The students, for instance, are all on what Goffman calls a team. They're all working together to give a performance collectively for the teacher. This doesn't mean they're all friends or that they even like each other. It just means that they all need to work together to pull off the show of being a good, attentive class. This is why your classmate whispers the answer to you. They're helping you maintain the class's performance of attentiveness by acting as a teammate. And the teacher goes on teaching. It's important to understand that in Goffman's analysis, the performances that everyone does all the time aren't necessarily adversarial. The students perform for the teacher, and the teacher performs for the students, but everyone involved wants the performance to go smoothly. You may not ever win an Oscar, but according to dramaturgical analysis, your social interactions are where your statuses, roles, and all of the expectations that they entail come together for you to give literally the performance of your life. And that performance is the stuff of social reality. Today we learned about social interaction. We talked about statuses, how you come to have them, and how they can conflict. Then we talked about how statuses impact your behavior by determining what roles you have. We explored why those roles matter by talking about the socially constructed nature of reality. Finally, we learned about the theory of dramaturgical analysis and how we can understand social interaction in terms of theatrical performance. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people. Our animation team is Thought Cafe, and Crash Course is made with Adobe Creative Cloud. If you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content you love. Thank you to all of our patrons. If all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump too? It's the lament of many an exasperated parent, but it's also kind of a profound sociological question. Because when you're talking to your parents, the answer is always no. But with the right group of friends, you might be quite happy to take a dive in the water. The thing is, you're a different person when you're a part of a group, and you're a different person in different groups. A family, a group of friends out for a swim, a business meeting, and a choir are different kinds of groups, and the same person can be a member of all of them. So if we want to understand how these groups are different, and even how they're similar, we need to talk about what social groups are and why they matter, both to the people who are a part of them and to the people who aren't. The choir, the meeting, the friends, and the family are all examples of social groups. A social group is simply a collection of people who have something in common and who believe that what they have in common is significant. In other words, a group is partly defined by the fact that its members feel like they're part of a group. This is obviously a pretty broad definition, but it does have its limits, and you can see these limits if you compare social groups to aggregates and categories. An aggregate is a set of individuals who happen to be in the same place at the same time. All the people passing through Grand Central Station at 1 o'clock on a Friday afternoon are an aggregate, but they aren't a group because they don't share a sense of belonging. Categories, meanwhile, consist of one particular kind of person across time and space. They're sets of people who share similar characteristics. Racial categories are a simple example. So the sense of feeling like you belong to a group is a defining feature of a group. But it also helps you differentiate different kinds of groups, specifically between primary and secondary groups. Primary groups are small and tightly knit, bound by a very strong sense of belonging. Family and friendship groups are primary groups. They're mutually supportive places where members can turn for emotional, social, and financial help. And as far as group members are concerned, the group is an end in itself. It exists to be a group, not for any other purpose. Secondary groups, however, are the reverse. These are large and impersonal groups whose members are bound primarily by a shared goal or activity rather than by strong emotional ties. A company is a good example of a secondary group. Employees are often loosely or formally connected to one another through their jobs, and they tend to know little about each other, so there's a sense of belonging there, but it's much more limited. That's not to say that coworkers never have emotional relationships. In fact, secondary groups can become primary groups over time, as a set of coworkers spends time together and becomes a primary group of friends. And while a gang of friends and a company clearly have a lot of differences, they also have at least one major similarity. They're both voluntary. If you belong to that group, it's because you choose to join. But there are also plenty of involuntary groups in which membership is assigned. Prisoners in a prison are members of an involuntary group, as are conscripted soldiers. Now that we understand a little bit about what groups are, we can start to study how they work, beginning with group dynamics, or the way that individuals affect groups and groups affect individuals. If we want to think about how individuals affect groups, a good place to start is with leadership. Not all groups have formally assigned leaders, but even groups that don't often have de facto leaders, like parents in a family. A leader is just someone who influences other people in the group. And there are generally two types of leadership. An instrumental leader is focused on a group's goals, giving orders and making plans in order to achieve those goals. An expressive leader, by contrast, is looking to increase harmony and minimize conflict within the group. They aren't focused on any particular goal. They're just trying to promote the well-being of the group's members. And just as leaders may differ in what they're trying to do, so too can they go about doing it in different ways. I'm talking here about leadership styles, of which we have 3. Authoritarian leaders lead by giving orders and setting down rules which they expect the group to follow. Such a leader earns respect and can be effective in a crisis, but at the expense of affection from group members. Democratic leaders, on the other hand, lead by trying to reach a consensus. Instead of issuing orders, they consider all viewpoints to try to reach a decision. Such leaders are often less effective during a crisis, but because of the variety of different viewpoints they consider, they often find more creative solutions to problems, and they're more likely to receive affection from their group's members. Finally, laissez-faire leaders do the least leading. They're extremely permissive and mostly leave the group to function on its own. This means lots of freedom, but it's the least effective style at promoting group solidarity and least effective in times of crisis. So leadership is one way that individuals affect groups, but groups also affect individuals. You can see this especially clearly in group conformity, where members of a group hew to the group's norms and standards. Basically, group conformity is the reason that you do jump off the bridge with your friends. And this has been demonstrated in some fascinating experimental results. Let's go to the thought bubble to learn about perhaps the most famous or infamous experiment on conformity. The Milgram experiment was run by American psychologist Stanley Milgram in 1974, and it was presented as an experiment in punishment and learning with two participants. One participant was the teacher, who read aloud a series of word pairs and then asked the other participant, the student, seated in another room, to recall them. The student was strapped to a chair and wired up with electrodes. For each wrong answer, the experimenter, who was standing beside the teacher, instructed the teacher to deliver a painful electric shock to the student. With each wrong answer, the intensity increased from an unpleasant few volts up to 450 volts, a potentially deadly shock. But the experiment was not about punishment or learning. The student was actually an actor, a confederate of the experimenter, and the shocks were not real. The experiment was designed to test how far the teacher would go in conforming to authority. At some point in the experiment, the confederate would feign extreme pain and beg the teacher to stop. Then he fell silent. If at any point the teacher refused to issue the shock, the experimenter would insist that he continue. In the end, 65% of participants went all the way, administering the presumably deadly 450-volt shock. And this is usually given as proof that people tend to follow orders, but there's a lot more to it than that. If the experimenter gave direct orders to the teacher, like "you must continue, you have no other choice," that resulted in non-compliance. That's when the teacher was more likely to refuse. The prods that did produce compliance were the ones that appealed instead to the value of the experiment, the ones that said administering the shocks was necessary for the experiment to be successful and worthwhile. So in this instance, the value of the experiment, of science, was a strongly held group value, and it helped convince the subjects to continue, even though they might not have wanted to. Thanks, Thought Bubble. This idea of group values points us to another important concept in understanding conformity: the idea of groupthink. Groupthink is the narrowing of thought in a group, by which its members come to believe that there is only one possible correct answer. Moreover, in a groupthink mentality, to even suggest alternatives is a sign of disloyalty to the group. Another way of understanding group conformity is to think about reference groups. Reference groups are groups we use as standards to judge ourselves and others. What's normal for you is determined partly by your reference groups. In-groups are reference groups that you feel loyalty to and that you identify with. But you can compare yourself to out-groups too, which are groups that you feel antagonism towards and which you don't identify with. And another aspect of a social group that can affect its impacts and dynamics is its size. And here, the general rule is the larger the group, the more stable but less intimate it is. A group of two people is obviously the smallest and most intimate kind of group, but it's also the least stable, because if one person leaves, there's no group anymore. Larger groups are more stable, and if there are disagreements among members, other members are around who can mediate between them. But big groups are also prone to coalitions forming within them, which can result with one faction aligning against another. The size of a group matters in other ways too, for instance in terms of social diversity. Larger homogeneous groups tend to turn inward, concentrating relationships within the group instead of relying on intergroup contacts. By contrast, heterogeneous groups, or groups that have more diversity within them, turn outward, with its members more likely to interact with outsiders. Finally, it's worth pointing out that social groups aren't just separate clumps of people. There's another way to understand groups, in terms of social networks. This perspective sees people as nodes that are all socially interconnected. You can imagine a circle of friends who are all connected to each other in different ways, some with strong connections in a clique or subgroup, while some are connected by much weaker ties. And you can follow the ties between all of the nodes outward to friends of friends and acquaintances who exist on the periphery of the network. Networks are important because even their weak ties can be useful. Think of the last time you were networking, following every connection you had to, say, land a job interview. Regardless of whether you think about groups as networks and ties or as bounded sets, it's clear that they have important impacts on people, both inside and outside. If you just looked at society as a bunch of individuals, you'd miss all the ways that groups impact our lives, by acting as reference groups, by influencing our decisions through group conformity, and much more. And groups are important for how society itself is organized. So next time, we're going to talk about one big part of that: formal organizations and bureaucracy. For now, we've learned about social groups. We talked about what social groups are and the different kinds of groups. Then we discussed group dynamics, how individuals affect groups and how groups affect individuals. We learned about leadership, group conformity, reference groups, and the impacts of group size. And finally, we talked about groups as networks and why networks matter. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people. Our animation team is Thought Cafe, and Crash Course is made with Adobe Creative Cloud. If you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content you love. Thank you to all of our patrons for making Crash Course possible with their continued support. Every year, we consume immense quantities of goods that make their way from one side of the planet to the other. But have you ever wondered how this enormous flow of goods is organized so that stuff made in China is available in stores in rural Montana? It happens because formal organizations make it happen. Our world is structured by formal organizations, and life as we now know it can't exist without them. But it's not all rainbows and butterflies and incredibly extensive trade networks, because within these organizations lurk some pretty substantial dangers. Okay, so when I talk about formal organizations, what does that mean? Like, I gotta wear a cocktail dress or a black tie? And is there, I don't know, a casual organization that I can be a part of instead, where people just wear flip-flops and maybe go floating? Well, sociologists think of formal organizations as groups that are organized to achieve goals efficiently. Now, that's obviously incredibly broad. That's why formal organizations are so diverse. They include everything from the IRS to Google to your local PTA. But you can understand these kinds of groups a bit better by thinking about the three main types of formal organizations. Utilitarian organizations, for example, serve some function for their members. Businesses pay their employees, and schools teach their students and also pay their teachers. Normative organizations, sometimes called voluntary associations, are organizations that people join as volunteers. They're called normative because people join them to pursue some goal that they think is morally worthwhile. This includes charities like the Red Cross, but also political parties and religious organizations. Finally, coercive organizations are ones where you don't have a say in whether you're a member or not. People are coerced into joining these organizations, often as punishment, as in prisons, or treatment, say through involuntary commitment into a psychiatric hospital. Now, these are all modern-day examples, but formal organizations have been around basically forever. They built the pyramids, they collected taxes across the Roman Empire, and they helped organize monasteries and convents. But there is a major difference between those formal organizations and modern ones, and that difference is between traditional and rational worldviews. This goes back to our friend Max Weber, who you hopefully remember from episode 9. A traditional worldview takes the basic setup of the world as given. The way previous generations did things, their values and techniques, is thought to be basically the right way. A rational worldview, on the other hand, sees everything as up for grabs and tries to find the most efficient way to accomplish a given task through critical thinking and calculation. It's the transition from traditional to rational worldviews, or the rationalization of society, that ushered in modernity for Weber. And we can see this rationality at work in an especially pervasive kind of formal organization: the bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is an organization that's been rationally constructed to do things efficiently. And according to Weber, every bureaucracy has 6 main things in common, which we introduced in episode 9, but to recap, its members each have specialized roles that fit together in a hierarchy, that is, a clear chain of command linked by formal written communications. Members of a bureaucracy also complete their work with technical competence, treating colleagues and customers without regard for their individual personal traits. That is, everyone's treated impersonally. And all of this functions according to detailed rules and regulations, literally by the book. These 6 traits make bureaucracies extremely efficient at what they do. But the very things that make bureaucracies effective also cause their share of problems. One problem is just that sometimes bureaucracies are not actually that efficient. Since bureaucracies are strictly hierarchical and rule-based, those rules can sometimes get in the way. This is what people mean when they talk about bureaucratic red tape. And that focus on rules leads to another kind of inefficiency: bureaucratic ritualism. In this case, the rules become a kind of end in themselves, ultimately interfering with the organization's goals. Faith in the rules can become just as damaging as faith in tradition ever was. And a group's goals can even shift so much that it comes down with what's known as bureaucratic inertia. This is where an organization's ultimate goal becomes just to perpetuate itself, to keep existing. This can be an intentional choice made by those who have the most to lose if the organization were to disappear, but it can also happen just because its members believe that the organization does good work. And it's not just that bureaucracies aren't always efficient or that their goals change. Their hierarchies create another problem, the problem of oligarchy, or the rule of the many by the few. Now, of course, a hierarchical organization is going to be an oligarchy. After all, in a hierarchy, the people at the top make decisions for everyone else to carry out. This is partly what Weber thought helped make bureaucracies so efficient. But in a lot of bureaucracies, like democratic governments, the people at the top of the hierarchy are elected or are appointed by people who are elected. So even if they're giving orders, it should still be considered a democratic organization, right? Well, here's where another sociologist, Robert Michels, saw a problem. He called it the iron law of oligarchy. He argued that regardless of how democratic a bureaucracy is in theory, in practice, it always tends toward pure oligarchy. The people at the top may be elected, but because of their position of power, they're actually insulated from the people who elected them. And even if the people in power are voted out, those who replace them become just like the ones they replaced because of the way the system is structured. Finally, what Weber saw as the worst danger of bureaucracy was something called bureaucratic alienation. Bureaucracies are supposed to run with machine-like efficiency, consistency, and calculability. But people aren't machines. So bureaucracies can be dehumanizing to those who work in them and those they serve. When a clerk at the DMV can't help you because you didn't follow some obscure rule, they're doing their job right. And if they exercise their personal reasoned judgment and ignore the rule, they're doing their job wrong. To be a good bureaucrat is not to think for yourself, but to be a good cog in the machine. Despite all these problems, we still see rationalization all over the place, including in the workplace, through what's known as scientific management. Scientific management is a system devised by American engineer Frederick Taylor, who in the early 1900s sought to make industry work more efficiently. He came up with a process in which management closely observes and systematizes how workers do their jobs so that those jobs could be refined over time, making them more efficient. Taylor's ideas were incredibly influential, and in time, companies across the US adopted them. So from governments to corporations, the bureaucratic model of formal organizations has taken hold to be a regular part of modern life. But in addition to the problems that bureaucracy can cause, American formal organizations in particular have faced many challenges over the last century due to changes in what's called the organizational environment. Simply put, that's just the environment in which organizations exist and operate. The organizational environment includes things like technology, political and economic trends, and population patterns. And in the US, one of the main challenges that formal organizations have faced is the growing recognition that many of them were either racist or sexist or both. Following the civil rights and feminist movements in the 1960s and 70s, hiring practices that excluded people who weren't white men came under increasing fire. While excluding job candidates on the basis of race or gender might seem to go against Weber's idea of technical competence, it's important to understand that that's not how those doing the hiring saw it. Often they believed that those who were excluded were simply incapable of doing the work. Until they were forced to do otherwise by changes in the organizational environment, many were quite happy to go on excluding large swaths of their talent pools. More recently, another challenge has come in the form of big economic shifts and the changing nature of work itself. As the US transitions from an industrial to post-industrial economy, there are fewer manufacturing jobs and more jobs based around creating and processing information. Frederick Taylor's vision of work as a series of discrete rote tasks might have been a good way to improve assembly lines, but applying it to things like programming, design, or marketing just hasn't worked. As a result, we've seen a lot of important changes in the organizations that house these newer kinds of jobs. Workers have more creative freedom and more flexibility around when and where they work, and organizational hierarchies have flattened. Compared to old-style bureaucracies, average employees in the information industry have a much more direct connection to their leadership. But not everything has changed in the American workplace. While big changes have taken place in high-skilled jobs that require creative work, lower-skilled jobs, which are now mostly in the service sector, are just as amenable to Taylor's scientific management as ever. And rationalization is alive and well in many other aspects of society, too. If anything, it continues to spread. Sociologist George Ritzer has called this the McDonaldization of society, the process by which the principles of the fast food restaurant have come to dominate the whole of society. Few things, after all, are more hyper-rational than fast food. The whole industry is based on the principles of efficiency, predictability, uniformity, and control. The point of fast food is that you get your food quickly and just as you expect it, And that's because the way the food is made is precisely controlled. And Ritzer argues that these principles are having a growing impact in our society at large. In education, for instance, we see more emphasis on standardized tests and tightly controlled curricula that run students through the system in 4 years flat. All of this brings us to what Ritzer calls the irrationality of rationality. As we saw with bureaucratic ritualism and alienation, rational systems are often unreasonable, impersonal. The reliance on rules and procedures can leave no room for independent judgment, basically denying people their status as independent thinking beings. So rational formal organizations are a necessary part of our world. They're how goods from all over the world end up on shelves here in Montana. But they're also a part of modern life that deserves our close attention. Today we learned about formal organizations. We talked about the historical process of rationalization and its impact on organizations in the form of bureaucracy. We discussed how organizations change in response to their organizational environment. Finally, we talked about the negative consequences of rationalization in organizations. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people. Our animation team is Thought Cafe, and Crash Course is made with Adobe Creative Cloud. If you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the